Welcome to the Crypto Bootloader training series. In part 2, we'll discuss the definition of security, known attacks, and security measures. When defining a security architecture, it is important to first set the objectives and limits of the solution to be applied. To define the security architecture for a crypto bootloader, the following aspects were taken into account. Asset. What needs to be protected? The firmware image, including code and data stored within it. Threat agent. Against whom do we need to protect the asset? We define two types of attackers. A passive attacker who sits on the line and listens to the information being sent back and forth, and an active attacker who, besides spying on the communication channel, is able to interact with the device. Attacker access. Where must the asset be protected? The firmware image needs to be protected in transit, that is, from the moment it leaves the product manufacturer's trusted environment to when it reaches the microcontroller memory in the field. Threat types. What could an attacker potentially do to the asset? A passive attacker is able to eavesdrop on the communication channel to obtain a copy of firmware images sent in plain text. This can lead to intellectual property theft. For example, an attacker may disassemble the firmware image to recover secret algorithms, cryptographic keys, or other intellectual property stored within the device. By getting a hold of the firmware image and analyzing the hardware of the device, the passive attacker may also be able to clone the product for which the firmware was intended. An active attacker has the capabilities of a passive attacker, but in addition to eavesdropping, is able to interact with the device. For example, by replaying the obtained information, the attacker is able to make use of old versions of the firmware image to downgrade the device to a previous valid version. This type of attack is a popular attack vector against cell phones and gaming consoles. Alternatively, the attacker may also modify the firmware image that he obtained. This can be used, for example, to introduce backdoors into a device. Lastly, the active attacker is able to create his own unauthorized firmware image if he possesses enough information of the hardware which runs it, gaining complete control over the device. Here are a couple of example hacks that could exploit vulnerabilities in the firmware update process used in end products and systems. For example, with a printer. Each time the printer accepts a print job from a computer, it examines the job for any software updates that might be included in the request. If the firmware doesn't require a digital signature to verify that an upgrade is authentic, attackers could send specially crafted files to the printer that contain malicious code. They could do so remotely if the computer was configured to print jobs sent to it over the internet. Another example is of a hospital drug pump. In this hack scenario, an attacker wouldn't need physical access to the pump because the communication modules are connected to hospital networks, which are in turn connected to the internet. These pumps might use a serial connection connected to these communication modules to remotely access and update the pump's firmware. The serial connection would be little concern if the pumps accept only legitimate firmware updates. But if the pump accepts any update, then anyone can alter the software on the pumps. A hacker could change the dosages of drugs delivered to patients and alter the pump's display screens to indicate a safe dosage was being delivered. In order to increase the security of the firmware image, it is important to take measures which will counter the threats that we described in the security definition. Different solutions may be used to apply a given security measure. To protect against eavesdropping, firmware alteration, and forgery, we turned into cryptographic primitives which ensure confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity. The solutions chosen are based on symmetric key cryptography, namely encryption to ensure confidentiality, which acts against eavesdropping, and message authentication codes to provide integrity and authenticity checks, which in turn act against firmware alteration and forgery threats, respectively. Bootloader protocol measures were chosen to protect against downgrading attacks. These attacks would occur when an attacker replays a valid old firmware image which potentially contains exploitable bugs. The the measures chosen for Crypto Bootloader to counter downgrading attacks rely on the insertion of metadata into the packet structure.